We have 6 short presentations, and our presenters will be about 10 minutes each of that, with a little bit of time for questions and answers. And I'd like to introduce, first of all, my good friend and colleague, Janet. Janet will be speaking on production service and supply chain, a business model incubated by Taiwan's entrepreneurs. So Janet, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I really enjoyed all of your speech, especially Michael and Rice, and it's definitely eye-opening for all of us. And I enjoyed his speech last year, and I requested to have another speech this year, and I've really learned a lot. And I'm very honored to present my case, the Taiwan case business model. After his speech, he talked a lot about collaboration. He talked a lot about supply chain. And I want to introduce this supply chain model, a business model that is being really shown its power after COVID. Before COVID, maybe they're the hidden jewels, but now they're really being revealed for their usefulness. So let me just get on with it real fast. First of all, I just want to quickly do a little bit of a cluster definition right here. That definition is using, cluster mapping definition is using the grouping 778 of 6-digit NAICS code, which are the industry code, international industry code that is being used to quantify the sales, employment, and even productivities. But by using this, I've been working cluster mapping in the past 15 years or so. It's been a long time, at least 10 years I've been focusing on it, using 3 sets of census data from Taiwan. And I was always puzzling about, well, there's some part kind of belongs there and some part doesn't. So I'm going to talk about what belongs there, what doesn't. And now I'm kind of being out of the cloud now, especially after COVID. I think that's the only thing that's positive about COVID to me. It's now I'm really, really understanding about the production service. Now we understand nowadays the biggest cost nowadays and the shortage is semiconductor chips for all industries that require electronics and certain kinds, especially consumer electronics, especially in car manufacturers. Not only the transportation has been going up in a scale of 10 times, so as the undersupply of the semiconductor chip to make the products more advanced, more competitive. So how does semiconductor play a role in the supply chain in Asian way? Okay, and so I'm going to talk about production service. Now we understand from the NAICS code, there is either manufacturing or services. They're very well segregated sectors. That gave me a lot of confusion in the past 10 years about how do I actually extract those information from either NAICS or from cluster mapping definition codes to actually describe Taiwan's supply chain positioning. So first of all, let's just see where Taiwan is. This little island here is Taiwan. Okay, it's very small. And smaller than Japan, smaller than Korea, much, much smaller than China. And it's isolated by an ocean. So it's just an island. It's about the size of Netherlands, a little bit more people than Netherlands. So you can imagine for European, you can see how small they are. So being small with very little resources, they have to survive. So ever since 70s, they have been making clothing, and supplied to the Western world, such as Kmart. That was their Asian miracle of export-led growth from the 60s after the World War II of Reconstruction. And both Taiwan and South Korea economies have developed from the same period, but they took a different route. So for Taiwan, who focuses on production services, now they do produce, but they're providing services because they're not tagging their own production names. They don't work on brands. Unlike South Korea, they have Samsungs and they have Kias, and they work on branding. So is Japan. And China is starting to make their own brands nowadays. So the definition of branding is very confusing too. There's so many different definitions. And I have researched, it is still very confusing. What do you brand? You brand the product, you brand a company, you brand your reputation, you can brand almost everything. Now, with the supply chain is actually a model of division of labor. And that started in the 18th century, division of labor and making mass productions and utilizing their expertise. So supply chain is actually division of labor of expertise. And then how we define production service, enabling blue ocean strategy for customers to compete, especially semiconductor. This is how I actually defines production service for the business model of Taiwan. And I will just go into a little bit more detail since my time is limited. So now I'm going to talk about Taiwan's model, electronic production service business model in supply chain. It actually started in the 60s. So as semiconductors started in the 60s, becoming commercially available. And at Silicon Valley, because semiconductor, because of the material silicon that makes the transistors works in a very, very small size. So for Taiwan in the late 60s and 70s, the government, just like Michael was talking about, top-down, policy-driven, policy-led economic growth. Taiwan did that in the 70s of starting E-Tree. That's where Tony is working at. And that was a really good research center that provided all the needed training and background and experience for high-tech market growth. So they early on identified they want to get into electronics and high-tech. And it's all policy driven from the 60s and 70s. And so that today we hear that Foxconn, very famous, they provide production service for computers, electronics, and all kinds of products. And so as TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Company, that is providing semiconductor production service. Even Taiwan was named as Computer Kingdom, although that name has been taken over by China's productions. But Computex every year in June still carries on. And that's one of the important meetings for all computer manufacturer to attend to find out what is the latest new products. And so semiconductor cluster was initiated by Taiwan's government's initiative in Hsinchu, which is northwest of Taiwan. And TSMC was born in the 80s. In the 90s, flux of scholars returned from the West, from the US, and were recruited in both academic and commercial sectors so that the activities, commercialization activities started. And it didn't take until now, after 40 years, that Taiwan's business model was servicing up and taking the world lead. And this is quite of a long journey for Taiwan. Taiwan is so small, its geopolitical situation A lot of people are equating Taiwan with the current war, that maybe someday China is going to invade Taiwan. This is all being brought up in the news, and all of a sudden everybody care about Taiwan versus before pandemic, nobody really care. Nobody even know where Taiwan is. But I want to say something. From cluster mapping analysis of utilizing 3 sets of census data, we know that 93% of manufacturing businesses are in production service, which is non-branded, because production service is making something for other brands like Apple, like HP, like manufacture card for Ford, for Toyota, and 84% of product manufactured are exported. So Taiwan doesn't keep a lot of their own product and carries without brands. They make for others, just like Kmart, just like Apple. 2 strong clusters for both employment and revenue. And there's only 2. And I'll show you the graph later. Information technology and analytical instrument, I call it IT, and distribution of those electronic commerce. And 56%, over half of IT revenue is from semiconductor. Despite that, it's only 4.26% of Taiwan total revenue. So let's take a look. This is all the clusters, service traded cluster, 51 of them. And there are 2 that stands out clearly on the revenue and the growth parts. All the rest are pretty much supportive roles, and they don't really shine out of 15. This is 15 years data in the collective growth, CAGR growth. Okay, one of it is information, IT. Another is distribution. This is employment growth. They equates very well. This 2 carries heavy weight for the overall, the whole Taiwan industries. Now, with the revenue growth, the semiconductor obviously stands out as number 1, and distribution is number 2. All the rest are pretty much up and down. Insurance services kind of surged, and that's one of the business parts. And let's take a look at the cluster data that we're looking at, this big, huge bubble here. This is IT bubble. You can see the revenue stands out as number 1, dominating. When I saw this 10 years ago, and I was telling my professor, I said, there's only 2 industries in Taiwan that is important. And it was kind of surprising to my professors as well. If this is what's coming from cluster mapping, then we better trust it. But then I puzzled about, out of this whole bubble right here, over 56% of it is IT. And 80% of them, that means half of the pie out here is actually semiconductor. And there's another shares here is electronics parts and components, which I can't get it from the cluster mapping data. I have to go back to the NAICS code, extract the details, and to find out what are the semiconductor, what are the electronics components. And all the rest is really just a few percentage, 10% left. And that only shows this whole big chunk that is so important for Taiwan. So my question is, how important is it? 2 years ago, for the past 8 years, I say, well, it's a big bubble. It's important for Taiwan. Just how important is its positioning in the competitions to the world? And will that be dangerous because there's only 1 there? Now, obviously, pandemic has proven that it's not dangerous, and that has given my answers. And so since IT is most important, and there are 2 representative, one is the semiconductors. TSMC is taking over 51% of the world, over 51% of foundries service to the world. So they are the winner. Okay. And over 2018, that's a time when the competitiveness of TSMC has risen and overrides Intel. Now we know Intel is a brand. They make their own chips for their own usage, Intel Inside. TSMC makes for the rest of the world who's not Intel, whoever needs their competitive advantage with their building innovations and IP protection, they go to TSMC. In Silicon Valley, when my friend is having a brand new innovation, they ask me, who do I go make my own chips? I say, there's no doubt. You don't even have a second thought. It has to be TSMC because they protect your right. You can trust them. Okay, so here's 51% of the market, and Apple is their big customer, and so as Qualcomm, even AMD. Okay, even their even Intel today has signed contract utilizing having TSMC to manufacture some of their subcomponents with a very, very advanced 3-micron, nanomicron technology. And TSMC is now the leader of today's semiconductor production technology. But TSMC only makes service. They don't have their own products. They make production for their customers to compete. And that's a service to their customers. And all of their customers can compete with each other. TSMC do not compete with their customers. That's their strategy. Profit margin, TSMC has 41%, and Foxconn with the manufacturer is about 4%, very low. And this is one of the reasons why semiconductor service, production service, it's a very, very profitable business. And let me jump around real fast. This is their diamond analysis, and I have put down the diamond analysis based on the strength. Morris Chang used the strength of people are very hardworking, highly educated, with a low-code labor, but their weaknesses is that they don't speak English very well. They're not very well trained in English. They're very shy about going to market, so that branding is not something that they're very strong with. So they avoided branding because of their local conditions. And since opportunity comes, they take on the opportunities with their strength and dealing with the threat. The threat actually shines Taiwan's production supply chains. So Taiwan's success is built on service branding, okay? Service branding is, I would like to differentiate that as a production service. And there is one company that stands out, Giant Bicycle, who does have their product branding, but very, very few companies in Taiwan does their own branding. 90%, over 90% of them are doing the service branding, okay, production service, and export their products out. So to conclude that, the challenges for cluster mapping to analyze production service business model, I would like to get a little bit more research with my colleagues at MOC or maybe TCI to have further discussion, maybe this monthly discussion. I would like to maybe ask for collaboration and joint effort to further on develop this supply chain-based production service business model. Thank you.
Thanks kindly, Janet. Okay, super. So do we have any questions? Any questions on the chat for Janet? Okay. Okay. I simply have one which someone else has put to me. Janet, very, very quickly, because we have to stick to the time limit.
Sure.
is it time to redraw the cluster mapping of the semiconductor industry? You said at the start that the semiconductor industry, the cluster mapping has shown some characteristics which you mentioned about Taiwan's competitiveness. Is it you weren't very confident with it? Very, very quickly, is it time to redraw the cluster map, to redefine it?
I think the cluster map can be redrawn based on Michael Green's concept. It is collaboration, and it is about supply chain. If we can redraw the cluster map to include the importance of supply chain and obviously clearly identify the supply chain, who are providing services, who are the products, and then we can quantify it, then we can see the competitiveness and the productivity that way. So that was my frustration. But I think I found a little bit of pathway to go further, but I still need help. Thank you.
Okay, great. And very quickly from Debraj, semiconductor shortage. So being concentrated in a few companies is now being questioned. Is that a valid question?
Yes, that's a valid question. And TSMC, it's the leader now, over 51% of the supplier for competitors' products. And there's one reason for it, because TSMC over the past 40 years has heavily invested into improving the production technologies, not on the product technology, but production service technology. That's what they're focusing on. And it takes billions and billions of investment to do it. Even Taiwan government itself is not able to supply that much money, and they have to use their earnings to reinvest in themselves. This is the reason why they win over Intel. Intel is focusing on their product. So they lag behind on production service because there's only that much profit you can utilize on innovations. And it's very expensive on semiconductor innovations, especially on equipments and production process. And that's where TSMC focuses on. And they are into 2 nanomicrons technologies, and they're leading now. And in order to get to that point, it will take at least 10 years, a whole bunch of PhDs, experienced industrial people, and billions of dollars to do it.
Okay. All right. Thanks so much, Janet. It's going to take billions. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Janet. That's very good. Thank you. A round of applause to you. Thanks kindly.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot.